And welcome back. My next guest is New York State Assemblyman Ken Zebrowski. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ken, it's a delight to have you on the program. And we've worked very closely together throughout the years, both in government and outside of government. And you're a real partner to me in the town of Clarkstown. And I want to thank you for being my guest today. And maybe we could, just jump into a bunch of the topics and issues that I know that you're working on. But before we do that, for the benefit of our viewers, why don't you just give a little bit of an overview of yourself, how long you've been in the Assembly, your background, and what led you into the Assembly.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me again. This is a great way for our joint constituencies to learn about different issues, and I do appreciate our working relationship. I think one of the most important things in our levels of government is to have a seamless, collaborative relationship, because oftentimes when constituents walk into our offices, they don't know whether it's a town problem or a state problem or a county problem. That's our job to figure it out. Sure. So a little bit about my background. I grew up here in Clarkstown. I went to Clarkstown schools before going on to SUNY Albany and Seton Hall Law School. I'm an attorney by trade, practiced law for a number of years. I still practice law a bit, actually, although it's virtually impossible with the demands of this job. But I still do consider myself a lawyer and an attorney, and enjoy still being an attorney. And really, in some ways, it's similar to what we do. It's helping folks and counseling folks on various different areas. Been in the Assembly. I was elected in 2007, so it's hard to believe it's about 10 and a half years now, which is a number of terms. We're 2-year terms. Time flies by in the blink of an eye. So throughout that time in the Assembly, hopefully, I've made a positive impact for the residents of not only Clarkstown, but the rest of my district. I represent District 96, which includes the entire town of Clarkstown, entire town of Haverstraw, and I have 3 villages in Ramapo, New Hempstead, Pomona, and about half of Wesley Hills. So an Assembly district's about 130,000 people. So everything from the local issues that you and I have collaborated on, thinking some of the environmental things and fighting the fence over on Lake DeForest. Sometimes people don't realize some of those nuts and bolts issues that we deal on, or some of the bigger stuff for Rockland County, whether it's our school districts. Certainly East Ramapo has had a lot of issues, things up with the debt in North Rockland, even here in Clarkstown, dealing with sometimes the Palisades Mall or other big ratepayers and tax challenges and things like that, to trying to collaborate with our local governments to bring ratables and businesses in here. One of the first things I had done early on in my tenure there was fighting to make sure that Rockland was included in all the economic development projects. Sometimes they try to label New York City, label upstate New York, but we're sort of left in this middle range. So left out of some programs that affect either of those regions. So it's been a whirlwind, but every day I wake up, I don't know what problem is going to walk through my door or what we're going to have to deal with. And of course, there's always the big ticket issues, dealing with our schools and the environment and property taxes, those things that we're constantly trying to take a step forward on.
So and we're filming this the latter part of February, and so now the calendar's kind of ramping up for you. Maybe you just give our residents a flavor of what your schedule's like as an assemblyman for the first 6 months of the year.
Sure. So right now we are smack in the middle of the budget process, but for these 6 months, I'm usually heading up to Albany on a Sunday night or a Monday morning, depending upon what my Monday morning schedule is. I'll be in Albany either 3, 4, sometimes 5 days a week as it gets towards the end of budget or the end of session. A lot of people ask me these questions. I think they find them interesting. I stay in a hotel up there. During our day up there, I have the formal things, committee meetings, session, which is what you can see on TV, the formal debate and voting on proposals and legislation. But I meet with up there hundreds of people throughout the course of a month. Oftentimes, especially during now in a budget season, I'll have a meeting every half hour on the half hour from about 8:30 in the morning till I head into session about 3 o'clock. And even then, when I head into session, you have people, if it's a consent calendar where there's not debate, trying to pull you out. And who are those people? People say, well, these lobbyists, and sometimes it's lobbyists, but the amount of issues the state deals with, everything from the stuff you would think, from school boards coming in, PTA groups coming in, environmental groups, to the individual professions, doctors groups and optometrists and people that are worried about very intricate things that are happening in state law and state policy or the state budget. Or maybe it's AARP or a group that represents people with developmental disabilities. You bounce from topic to topic to topic, and it keeps things tremendously interesting, sometimes tremendously challenging, jumping around, trying to keep it all together. So luckily I have a dedicated staff like you do that is there taking notes. But it's never a dull moment, and hopefully at the end of the day you feel like you accomplished some things and at least move the ball forward in other ways.
Oh, no, and it's very true, and I've had the pleasure of watching you grow in this job over the last 10 years. From two different perspectives, as a not-for-profit executive for a number of years, and also as an elected official prior as a councilman, and now as supervisor for going to my third year, and really to see you not just grow and how comfortable you are there, but how you become even more accomplished in Albany. You've had a number of pieces of legislation that have become law. And you really have kind of delved into, you have a lot of committees that you're part of. You're also chairman of a committee as well. So, and it's always been, I've always been impressed with your facility for learning the issues, because that comes through. And it doesn't always come through with some folks, while you rely on your staff, and you've got very competent staff, you know the issues. And I've always been impressed with that, because I pride myself as being somebody, I'll wear my staff out too, where I'm getting into the weeds on particular issues. You do the same thing, and it's great to be able to see how you have a problem presented, you're able to grasp it and kind of understand it, and then really kind of look for some type of solution. And exactly what you said, see if you can kind of move the ball forward. I know you've worked closely with me as supervisor now on a number of issues, like the forest fence. That was a big success. We had hundreds of residents that were very upset. Suez was going to be able to, was looking to put a fence around the entire reservoir that was going to have really negative consequences, and kind of the 1-2 punch, you and I working together. Suez listened, they stopped. The town, made a commitment to do some more things, and Suez made a commitment to really, step up as well. And that really happened because you had two levels of government working, together. But you understood that issue, and your staff helped with that. And we've had some meetings with the DOT, which I think have been they're going to bear some fruit down the road, and up front as well. So I definitely have been very impressed with that. But maybe there's a number of issues we could kind of delve into in the time that we've got left. I know because you're dealing with, and people have to remember, you're representing the local community, but there's regional issues, there's statewide issues. You're dealing with the state budget, which that's what, 160 some odd billion. It's an enormous amount of money that you're responsible for in terms of approving and allocating, and that's got to be done by April 1st each year. But you have these other issues that manifest themselves each year, like I know congestion pricing is one. And a number of the other issues. So why don't we kind of delve into some of those topics, and you can kind of give our residents an update, and then we could bring it back home towards the end on some of the local ones.
Sure. Well, thank you for the compliment, and I do appreciate us working collaboratively, because I think Mario Cuomo said you campaign in poetry but govern in prose, and oftentimes it really takes sitting down, being there, listening to constituents, and I'm glad we have that working relationship, because you can't get by in this business by just issuing press releases. You really got to understand the issues and be willing to dive in. So sure, we could talk about some of the issues that are around the state right now, and probably I see my first role as representing the area that I'm from. There's a reason why legislators have to live and come from the areas, and you just don't have a bunch of professional politicians that live in Albany. And that's because my first role is to look at the issues and represent this area and look at it through the lens of our Clarkstown and Rockland County constituents. So an issue like congestion pricing is a perfect example of how I have to bring the issues that are unique to Rockland to Albany on that type of big issue. So congestion pricing, for your viewers that don't know, is actually an issue that started with Mayor Bloomberg and now has been come back around with the issues with the subways and the lack of capital funding available for the MTA. If you picked up a newspaper, they called it the summer of hell for commuters. And certainly that infrastructure system affects not just New York City, but the entire region. Some of our commuters do utilize it, but New York City is an economic engine that we need to make sure that we foster so that us in the outer areas, outer suburbs, because it affects our economies as well. But that being said, we are constantly fighting so that our residents aren't unfairly burdened, unfairly taxed because of issues of New York City. And the MTA is a perfect example where west of the Hudson, where we sit right now, we don't have a train that we can get on and head right into the city. We either have to drive across the bridge, get on in Tarrytown or White Plains, or we have to take New Jersey Transit down to the Secaucus Junction or down to the path in Hoboken and hop over. So we do not have the same type of services that people in Westchester, people in Long Island, or people in the city have, yet we're in the MTA region and pay many of the same taxes. And that's the first fight I always have, is trying to get more services here to Rockland or change the entire structure. You and I weren't in these seats when they set up the MTA, but how they set up a system where no matter where you live and what type of service you are, you all pay the same taxes just doesn't make sense. So if we're going to institute new fees or new taxes, we got to recognize that west of the Hudson counties, Rockland, Orange, do not have the same services and should not be paying the same taxes. Congestion pricing is the idea that somewhere around 60th Street or 30th Street, they haven't set the level yet, but as you go into downtown Manhattan, you'd pay a separate fee. The idea being A, to reduce congestion, but B, to raise some money for the subway and the MTA system. So what's the problem with that? Well, if you're in Westchester and you're in Long Island, you can hop on a train and avoid that fee. If you are a commuter from Rockland County, you may not be able to avoid that fee. You have to head down the Palisades Parkway and pay $15 or so, $16 to head over the George Washington Bridge. Or if you're heading down the Garden State Parkway to one of the tunnels, you're paying a huge fee. So I don't like the idea of congestion pricing to begin with, but I always have to be prepared is if the legislature or the governor starts to go that way, am I prepared to fight it? Mm-hmm. So what we need, if they go that way, is some sort of an offset for the fees and the costs and the tolls that our residents are already paying to get across that river, because they don't have a train to get across that river. So it's right now, quite frankly, we have a report from a panel with a whole bunch of suggestions. The governor has yet to really put his stamp on any one of them. Mm-hmm. Even here we are in the middle of the budget cycle, we're still just going through the process. So in my mind, what do I worry about? A sort of late March, all of a sudden it coalesces around one proposal and we don't have an ability to morph it. So we're being proactive in making these arguments.
Which is great. And you have a challenging time this year. I mean, we're talking about close to a $4 billion projected deficit right now.
4.4, I think it is.
Wow, which is just, that's an enormous amount of money, and that's going to be a very challenging time because, there are infrastructure needs, there are projects that folks are looking at, there's issues that you're trying to address at the same time, and a lot of the issues don't really kind of get dealt with until the end of the budget process and the latter part of the session, April, May, and the part of June when you're up in Albany. Mm-hmm. But what's your prediction? You think we're going to be able to have an on-time budget again?
I think so. We've done so a number of years, and I'm a big proponent of having an on-time budget. At the end of the day, that's what government has to do. People have to get to the table and people have to compromise. Too often we see in other levels of government, not to pick on the federal government, but where they're just doing continuing resolutions, it's constantly late, and they're not setting a structure. Compromise isn't easy. You have people from different regions, different parties, but I think our residents expect us to be able to hit an online deadline. And what that means sometimes is that you don't get everything you want. And that's one of the more difficult things in a budget that large, is that I got to recognize that I have to sit there and have the needs of Rockland County addressed, but also the needs of Buffalo and Syracuse and Manhattan and Long Island. So I think we will. Just a couple other things that are of concern to me that are in the budget. Each star Property taxes, something you and I talk about and work on constantly. The STAR program is probably one of the biggest property tax savers for our residents. It's a direct deduction off your tax bill, or if you're a new homeowner, an actual check. So the governor and the budget has a freeze on that again. Right now it grows by a small amount, by 2% or so each year. But that adds up 5-10 years down the road. That's real money. So each year we've been able to unfreeze it, because every governor always tries to save money and freeze that growth. So we're worried about that. Of course, our education funding, there's some new issues in this right now for all of our school districts. They get a foundation aid, but they also have their expenses sometimes reimbursed. So there's caps on how much they can go up. So here in Clarkstown, if we get have a rise in special education students, or a rise in some other area, maybe it's building aid or maybe it's transportation, that gets covered by the state. Well, there's a provision in there to cap it at 2% how much that goes up. So it will be swallowed up by the school district, AKA our taxpayers. So there's a bunch of these provisions in the budget that may not be making headlines in the newspapers that matter to our residents here in suburban Clarkstown.
No, absolutely. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head too, because that's a major concern I think that everyone has now with the change in the federal tax laws. And what's taking place with that. While many folks are going to see some savings in terms of their take-home pay, in the end they're going to lose deductions, particularly as it relates to property taxes and where they're capped. And that's a real problem. There may not be a problem for people in lower taxed states, down south or out west, but they certainly are for our Northeast region. All of the states in the Northeast are really going to find some difficulty with that. And we've done a lot, and we've worked collectively on that. And last year, you carried the water for us on a bill that really helped us to make sure that the shift between property tax classes, between homestead and non-homestead, wasn't so great, and that really helped all of our residents, because there's this very complicated formulary that I think it's got about 29 or 31 categories that feed into this formula that's developed each year that determines whether the residential properties or the commercial properties are going to be favored one way or the other, and it can provide for some dramatic swings. And Clarkstown was one of the few towns, the only one in the region, that was able to have this legislation passed. You introduced it on our behalf, and we're able to get it through. Senator Carlucci co-sponsored a bill, companion bill, and that got passed. And I know we're looking at working on that again this year with you. So that's helped our residents in a very practical way, because while we've done our part to cut taxes and to keep them flat in my two years as supervisor, the shift, independent of us doing anything, the shift would have potentially put more of a burden on the residential homeowners in particular. And so to mitigate that shift between classes really was a big deal, and it will be a big help as well. What do you see coming forward out of the infrastructure talks in Washington, and how do you think that might impact the state going forward?
Well, I hope that we'll finally get some actual revenue for some of our bigger projects, whether it's the Tappan Zee Bridge, or some of the thruway or other corridors. For our commuters, quite honestly, if they did that Gateway project, the new tunnel, which would finally provide our residents a one-seat ride, and I know your administration has done a lot in terms of transit-oriented development in Nanuet, well, that would be a game changer for that line if people could get on a train, whether in Suffern or Nanuet, and get into New York City. So some of those big projects would be really important. And honestly, it's something that I think the federal government has gotten away from in the decades. When you think back to the Eisenhower administration and putting forth the funding and setting up our interstate highway system, and now to the point where we have a major new bridge, and it's really only federal loans that the state can bank on. Hopefully, they get a little bit more into looking at where regional needs are and how best to spend that money. But quite frankly, I'd love to see some more state and federal investment in our local roads, It's just, I don't have to tell you, I know running the town budget in and of itself and trying to figure out infrastructure needs, the amount of money that roads and new paving and culvert work costs is just staggering.
Yeah.
So any way that we can collaborate to help with some of those costs really helps our local governments, our taxpayers, and also, of course, the people that are driving on these roads.
No, agreed. And in fact, I'm proud of the fact that we put a lot of money historically and certainly in my administration into our own infrastructure. But you make a case in point. We're pretty much finishing up all the work that we have to do on our pools right now. Some work was done when I was on the council, but now, at this point. But we're investing several $1 million this year alone. So as people come out to start using Lake Nanuet and Jermons, they'll see that there's going to be a new bathhouse at Lake Nanuet. It was kind of caving in on itself. It should have been replaced 20 years ago, and was unsafe. And that's $1 million project. Just like that, $1 million that we had to kind of find dollars for. And Jermon's pool, we've done a multi-million-dollar facelift there, and now the interior, the bathhouses are all being renovated. So we should be done with our pools now for the next 10 years or so, which is a great relief. But we still have roads, and we've got street community center, and we've got other special projects, and it's just never ending. It's just like with a homeowner. You have to replace your roof. You have to paint the inside of your house, and you've got to do new siding and windows periodically, and it's just the cost of maintaining a home. Amplify that when you have a town with a $144 million budget, with 6 community centers and three pools and literally thousands of acres of town-owned land. The cost can become staggering, and then you figure a network of 310 miles worth of town roads, and how we can kind of keep up with that. It can really overburden the taxpayer. And you've been a real champion for us, and throughout not just my tenure as supervisor, but I know with the prior administration where you've been able to bring literally millions and millions of dollars back from Albany for capital projects. The case in point, the Traphagen project that you've helped with. We had the announcement about Rock and Country Day School, and we've got a number of other things, the police department roof, things that you've put money behind, and money that you're going to help access again this year for us. So I'm personally grateful for that, because it's very clear that we've got an ally, somebody that we can go to. You've kind of been our go-to person in Albany that can kind of draw down the dollars, for us. And not just us, but I've had that similar conversation with Supervisor Phillips in Haverstraw, where he's talked about how he's been able to really go to you as the go-to person for him in Albany as well.
Well, thank you for that. It's been a pleasure to work with both you and Supervisor Phillips, and both of you prioritize recreation, and it's a great way for our residents to utilize our parks, to utilize our pools with their kids. And some of these projects we've been able to collaborate on are just really exciting, whether it's the Rockland Country Day School or that Traphagen property, or right next to Jermon's pool. And I know some of your other thoughts and some of your other plans will really expand those type of recreational opportunities for people in Clarkstown. I know myself, look, I live right here in Clarkstown, and you could have found me this week walking around the Congers Lake a couple times with my wife as the weather warmed up a little bit. So it matters. It's certainly, living in the Northeast USA is an expensive place, but hopefully we can do what we can to make it more affordable, but also provide some of these recreational opportunities so it is a great place to live and work, which I think Clarkstown is.
No, it absolutely is. We're pretty much out of time, but I do, maybe we could just take a minute on, I know that you've helped coordinate some meetings with the state DOT, so why don't we just talk a little bit about that, and then I want to finish with you providing your contact info if anybody wants to get in contact with you. So I know one of the things we're looking at is Route 304, and it's kind of early on, but you were able to kind of coordinate. So maybe you could tell our viewers a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, Route 304, as anyone knows, is probably the major north-south corridor throughout our town, and anyone who's lived here for a few years can tell you that the congestion seems to be getting bigger and bigger, and it's important that we look at that corridor as a whole, and see what we can do in planning for the future to make it, to ease traffic, but also to make it safer for pedestrians. So you and I were out in the rain with some of the DOT officials looking at the various intersections. Your administration has done a great job in terms of mapping it out and really identifying with the police department where the choking points are and where some of the dangerous points are. Unfortunately, we've also had a few fatalities on that roadway. So it's incumbent upon us as government officials to be looking at each one of those. And sometimes it's the fault of a driver, obviously. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at all these intersections, trying to figure out how to make them as safe as possible. I think one of the nicer things now in all of our communities is one, a lot of commercial development in our town, some exciting new stores, places, and I think folks are also getting more and more used to walking throughout our towns, or maybe parking the car in one place and walking up and down our main street in New City, or if they live on the other side of 304, walking in the spring, summer, or fall down into our commercial. So we got to always be thinking, one, responding to any type of tragedies or things that happen, accidents, but also making sure that we're ahead of the curve for as our roadways become more congested, to figure out ways to ease that traffic and foster our corridors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate the efforts. I mean, it was great. DOT brought a full team down, and we met in town hall with my staff and along with you and with your staff, and that's where things happen, where you have two levels of government working together, and through your auspices being able to have DOT respond. And I think that there'll be some eventually there'll be some initial changes, and then hopefully there'll be a long-term plan that will be able to come for some upgrades along Route 304 throughout the upcoming years. So I want to thank you for that. So let's talk about just how people get in contact with you, and we could kind of leave it with that. So how can your constituents be able to connect with you, and if they've got an issue, if they want to communicate?
Well, there's always the old-fashioned way. 845-634-9791 is the phone number. We have a local office right here in New City, 67 North Main Street. It's the 3-story building right across from ShopRite, so you can stop in or give us a call, come in and talk about any issue. And of course, in this day and age, we're all utilizing email, so just my last name, Zebrowski, my first letter K, and that's at nyassembly.gov. You can find me on Facebook, you can find me on Twitter. We try to keep up with all the various options we have now to let people know what we're doing. And I really depend upon people coming forth with their concerns and their ideas. Government only works if you really have an engaged electorate.
Yeah, agreed, very much so. Well, Assemblyman Zebrowski, thank you so much for being my guest, but more importantly for your advocacy, your service to our community, and it's hard to believe it's over 10 years now.
Yeah.
But for these past 10 years, and again for your support of my administration and in our shared goals, but more importantly for your friendship these last 10 years. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thanks for our working relationship.
Great. And we'll be right back.